Hey everybody, we are teaching Tilt Brush, and today's teaching Tilt Brush is looking at a few of those tools that don't really seem to have a lot of good uses, but we're going to see what fun uses we can come up with. These are sort of weird brushes. So today we're going to be finding uses for weird brushes. And the three we're going to focus on today are Dr. Wigglez, which, as its name implies, is just a line that wiggles on its own. Let's turn off our straight edge for the moment. The second tool we're going to be looking at is HyperGrid, which again isn't one of those tools that get used very often because it does a very particular thing. And the third tool we're going to be really focusing on today is petals. These guys. And depending on your light source, depending on what you want to do with them, these little flowery shapes do seem to be sort of one-hit wonders. So we're going to look at how to use and control some of these weirder brushes and how they might be useful in one of your pieces of work. So let me clear these guys out. And we're going to start with a HyperGrid, as one of those very corner case brushes. Now you'll notice, as I draw this, I'm in freehand mode. It does try to keep that grid sort of in line with itself, very up and down, left and right. So even if I'm drawing in curves, it's trying to keep those straight lines. If I actually activate straight edge, that does not necessarily mean it's one contiguous piece. So you can see it might break it up into separate pieces. Different angles gives you different results. If I go for different brush sizes, you can see it does change the size of our grid here. So whether you want really small, skinny girders, or these larger pieces, HyperGrid really just gives you these straight lines and edges. Because it doesn't give you a nice smooth line, it can be tough to get the actual lines you want. This one really does sort of break up. You almost have to go over it several times to get a full grid, especially when you're getting into curves and things. With the straight edge active, it does give you straight lines, but those lines, again, you may have to redraw them to get a complete solid shape. Little tougher to control. When we get into circles and things, it actually is fairly nice. So here I have with my freehand, I'm going to do a perfect circle with our HyperGrid. And as you can see, it does give us a nice circle. Again, it's not necessarily fully contiguous. You can see there may be gaps and breaks in the circle itself. It'll try, especially as you go with different brush sizes and things, it'll still try to keep contiguous where it can. But you'll notice it still does break up. Maybe I'll try to go in manually to connect the dots. But now it's not quite the perfect circle I was hoping for. So it can be tough to control. What might help is, instead of drawing in those extra pieces, I'm going to select the circle and duplicate it. Take that same circle, but rotate it a little so the lines aren't necessarily in the exact same places as in the original. So now the circle fills in a little bit better by reusing the same circle. Now I'm going to select the circle again, duplicate again, duplicate, and again rotate to get it offset a little bit, and hope that that fills in the lines that I was missing. So we can work with circles, but the HyperGrid never fully connects on its own. Now if I go for full sphere, now that's a different ball game. So I'm going to keep my HyperGrid. I'm going to, instead of just stopping with a circle, I'm actually going to now continue on. Remember, Quest can't do this, but the PC, Link, all those, now look at that. This is a sphere with our hypercube. When I let go, this one actually is contiguous. Let me grab that and move it around and change its size. If we move around and look at this, it is indeed almost a solid piece. Much fewer gaps. They're not nearly as noticeable. If I take one of these guys, now I'm going to make a really big one here. Circle, sphere, really big sphere. Didn't give it to me. Let's try it again. Circle, sphere, really big sphere, let go. Now I'm actually inside the grid cage here. You can see it is nearly contiguous. Very few gaps in this. This is a very large sphere. We're going to back out here and shrink it down. You can see that sphere with a hypergrid. Now, because the line is a glowing line, it's going to be hard. Maybe I'm going to need to get a dark color. I'm going to see if I can fill it in with a hull here. Whoops, except I don't need the straight edge anymore. You can see through it. I'm just made a black blob in the middle. This is our hypergrid in a very large cube. Let's get rid of the gray cube. It's too big. There we go. So we're inside the hypergrid sphere. Because it's a glow, it's hard to make it seem like an object and not a glow. So having it to make a geodesic dome looks good in theory, but because it's transparent and solid glowing lines, there's no shadow and highlight, it's an unlit brush, sometimes it can be tricky to work with. But that's the HyperGrid as a paintbrush. Got some interesting uses, especially good for framing and outline, or if you wanted to do like a city at night. But the HyperGrid, that's its main controls. The next brush that we're looking at is called Dr. Wigglez, and it's one of our animated brushes. It just wiggles, hence the name. Depending on what color, what darkness, it's pretty much just a normal paint style of brush. It's just animated, and you notice the animation is pretty much the same regardless of size, regardless of color. It's still going to be this repeating animation. If we back off and make it really long, you do see there is a direction to that movement. In this case, it's sort of going up. So if I paint it up as opposed to painting it down, you can see there is a difference in the way the motion goes. Actually, let's make it a little easier for you guys to see. Painting it down as a motion versus painting it up as a motion, there is implied direction depending on how you paint the brush. So this one you can actually see it's sort of going up in the animation. This one's sort of going down in the animation. So like disco, it moves in the opposite direction you're painting. So this could be good for things like another form of water, moving water. If I have various shades of blue going down here, it could give you the feeling of moving water. Little bits of highlight, that type of thing. A flow in a direction. So Dr. Wigglez does have good use if we're trying to give that subtle motion, especially on a smaller size, surrounded by other brush strokes of the same color. That little suggestion of motion can really bring a painting to life. So if I have a landscape, a little bit of wiggles on the stream to go with streamers types of thing. It's not obvious unless it's standing by its own like that, but worked with another painting, it can give you a lot of subtle motion. Just like our other brushes, we can do, let's get back to Wigglez here. We can do our straight edge circles, and it will indeed do. See if we can get one going here for us. Of course, it's a dark color, so we can barely see it. Here's an example of a Dr. Wigglez circle. Let's get a brighter color in here. Recolor Dr. Wigglez. So you can see how there is an implied motion, an implied direction to this circle. This would be a skinny Dr. Wigglez. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select him, duplicate him, and we'll make one that's slightly smaller. Duplicate. Make one slightly smaller. Duplicate. Slightly smaller. Duplicate. You can see where I'm going with this. I can get a whole bunch of these things going. And since they're all duplicates, they're all traveling in the same direction, here's a very interesting whirlpool type of effect where all these things are moving. We can get it right up to the camera. There's a lot of motion going on. So Dr. Wigglez can be used creatively to really give a lot of interesting effect. This whirling motion with just concentric circles, but they're all traveling together. So I'm going to take my Dr. Wigglez here. Instead of just a circle, we're going to open them up to a full sphere. Let's get those off to the side. Let's get these out of the way. Go away. And we're going to make an actual Dr. Wigglez sphere. We'll move our whirlpool off to the side there. And we'll get a new sphere going here. So, circle, sphere, eventually. You want to give me a sphere. Come on. There we go. So if I open up to a cup or keep it down as a sphere, you can see how the whole thing is still animated, is still moving. Now here's a case where I made the sphere with a skinny brush. So the sphere is made of skinny lines, but they're all still moving. I'm going to keep that sphere, but now I'm going to go up to a really wide brush and do that same sphere. But on a much wider brush, it does change the way those loops look. So there's our circle. Here's our sphere. See how it's trying to maintain gaps? The gaps aren't quite as wide. The whole sphere, even though it's done at pretty much the same scale, the sphere with a wider brush actually has a wider brush and a wider gap between them. So it maintains the same type of proportion as far as the brush size and the gap between them, but because it's a bigger brush, there are fewer strokes required to go all the way around. So the size of your brush as you make these different shapes will affect the outcome. I could then just resize this brush, but the skinny brush is what gives me these fine many lines, thick brush, fewer strokes around the sphere. But with Dr. Wigglez, you can see the whole thing is still moving. Now that whole brush is still one piece, so a single recolors the whole thing. Dr. Wigglez, anytime you want that little bit of motion with a little bit of direction that you can paint using your brush. So the third of our weird brushes is Petal. On the last page, now this one, if I have no straight edge, if you click and drag a short burst, let's do it on your perspective here, you can see how it makes the petals. That's just a very short click with motion. If I do a click without moving, nothing really happens. But if I move even just a little bit, it starts to bring those petals in. If I move more, we get longer and longer petals. That waver, since I do not have the straight edge turned on, any wavering of my hand does indeed waver the petal. And if you go too far, it can get really, really strange. With the straight edge active, it's always going to be nice and straight relative to the way your hand moves. With the different sizes, it is the different sizes of these petals. So without the straight edge, I can wobble them, I can spin them, I can play with their shape, but if I want to keep it more regular, we're going to use the straight edge to keep them in whatever direction we're painting. Now with these petals, let's get a nice brighter color here. With a normal petals, If you wave it too much, it'll actually restart the pedal, or if I'm going back and forth, you can see it often will restart the pedal. It can't always get one pedal following the whole shape. So you can't really get too artistic with a single pedal stroke. A lot of times, the pedal itself isn't used so much for the artwork, but for a skeleton, a base. Now that I've got this pedal in place, I might switch to some of the other brushes to embellish, to add details, to follow the lines on. Maybe we're going to use some of the wires to make the, inner, pistil, that type of thing. So a lot of times the pedal isn't used as the primary brush, but as just a skeleton to set up where we're going to go in with our other brushes to make it more of an interesting flower. But it's an easy way to get 5 regular lines in an easy to use, easily reproducible pattern. Pedal for making a base out of these pieces. Now the pedal can do not only straight edge, but the pedal can be used for our circles and spheres as well. So I've got my straight edge going with a pedal, which gives me nice regular petals. And if I go into the full circle mode, it does indeed try to twist that flower shape into a tubular circle. So now that I've got it, let's grab this guy so we can take a look at this shape. It is taking that petal shape and indeed bending it into a full circle. Now this starts having a lot of interesting applications that you can use in a lot of different things. Maybe we'll use it as a fancy earring on one of the models, or maybe we'll use it as a cornucopia or a trumpet or ram's horns, that type of stuff. But now this shape has a lot of interesting uses other than just a flower petal shape. So that's using the flower petal in a circle. PC-based users can even take that petal shape and turn it from a circle, into a sphere of petal. Circle, 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 slam. See how it's not responding at all? This is what Quest users go through when they're trying to use a tool that doesn't work. Petal, even on PC, doesn't want to go into a sphere. I could do multiple petals in our circles like this, but I can sit here all day trying to get it into that center, and even on the PC, the petal doesn't go full sphere. This is what Quest users are dealing with when they're trying to follow some of my other sphere examples. They can sit here and do this all day, no matter how perfect their aim is on that center point. It's just not going sphere on us. So our petals, we can make these lovely rings. We can make these lovely different shapes. Now I'm going to grab this one, and we're going to select it, and we're going to shrink it down. We're going to put it overlapping this one. But you can see it's just going to be circles. But the petal is one of the few shapes that even a PC doesn't want to deal with. Circles, no problem. Spheres, even a PC doesn't want to make a sphere out of the petals. Hey, there we go. It is resistant, but we have finally conquered. Now, if we look at this closely, I knew we could get this. Pointy on one end, wide in the middle, and on this end, it's multiple points, the points of the petal. Let's get this to a smaller size. Here at the small size, this is the pointy end, this is the flowery end. You can see it breaks into several small pieces. Boy, the petal really hates going. Also, as you start getting larger sizes, this is one of the ones that can make even a more powerful computer start to freak out. So you can see how everything's sort of a little juddery at this larger size. Doesn't affect the stream as much as it affects the headset. A sphere of petal. If we go super small, you can see how it breaks up. It has trouble finding where those petals go at the super small size. But the moment we bring it out, there we finally have our petal sphere. You can see how frustrating it is on a quest when people are trying to do things and it doesn't work. Now, Petal is a lit brush, so it does have shadows and highlights. So as you have things inside the sphere, you can see the shadows and highlights. There we go. So even though at first glance, Petals, Hypercubes, and Dr. Wigglez seem really corner case, you really can't see lots of different ways of using them. But once you start experimenting with them, once you start playing with them, you can see how our Petals, it's almost this multi-layer sphere once you got them going. Or even just the rings, we have these interesting tubular shapes. Try out these even weird, strange brushes. See what they inspire. See what sort of creative new uses you can come up with. So even though you think you know what this HyperGrid does, maybe you can come up with some interesting ways of using them in artwork that people aren't expecting. Dr. Wigglez, HyperGrid, and Petals. 3 unusual brushes, but once you start playing with them, you can start coming up with some creative uses. I'm going to switch to Dr. Wigglez for our usual closing message. I can keep my petal spheres over here just because I'm so pleased we actually got them to work. Dr. Wigglez. Okay, so we do this every week. We've got new lessons coming about the different tools and different ways of using these tools to make artwork. Tilt Brush is by Google and is available for any of our VR headsets. The Quest is slightly limited with some of the tools it can do, but overall they've been adding more and more extra controls and expansions to the Quest, so hopefully you guys will even be able to do just as much as the regular PC and Steam-based headsets. Thanks for joining us. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions or any other lessons you'd like us to teach. And we'll see you here on youtube.com/shamelessmayhem, as well as live on Twitch TV/shamelessmayhem. Have fun with Tilt Brush, everybody.